Amen.
Sede sapientiae.
Ora pro
Nomine
nobis.
Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. All right. So we are on page 25 of this book. All right. Number 2, we're talking about the motives internal to the religion. 2, it is also miraculous that the preaching of the faith brings holy delight by its own unction, even though it austerely proposes arduous precepts. See, so, as I said, the morality of the Catholic Church is the strictest of any religion that ever existed. It duly offends the evil inclinations of the sinner and nonetheless profoundly draws his heart to bringing it peace. This intimate reconciliation of the greatest unction and austerity indicates that it involves God's special assistance. So, in other words, you couldn't have those two things together without some divine origin. By contrast, false religions are pleasing through a kind of false piety, do not impose difficult obligations, do not raise the sword against the spirit of error and evil, and do not bring true inner peace. Right, so Protestantism, you can decide whatever you want to do. So they please men in order to achieve human acclaim and do not labor for the glory of God. If it sometimes is the case, as in that of Montanism or Jansenism, that they commend immoderate austerity, they lack unction and destroy harmony. Finally, the extraordinary efficacy of words is clear if countless hosts of people, not only men who are simple, but also the wise, in contempt of visible things, are moved efficaciously to invisible and utterly lofty things, notwithstanding the countless hindrances involved therein, indeed sometimes in the midst of the tyranny of persecutors. So that was true in the Roman Empire, for example. This sign will be even greater if this doctrine perpetually preserves its influence while other doctrines die off. So the long-term existence of the Catholic Church and its changeless doctrine is indicative of its divine origin. Again, this applies only to the Catholic Church before Vatican II. Right, it all falls apart in the light of what they are attempting to do to the church. So you can't make this argument with regard to the Novus Ordo. In relation to its origin, the argument can be perfected, and the impossibility, not only moral but also psychological, that this doctrine would be natural in origin can be made manifest if it is historically clear that it appeared without human preparation, that is, neither being elaborated by the human genius of the person teaching it, nor having been eclectically concocted from other sources. So therefore, St. Thomas says that it is loftier than a physical miracle, something marvelous, namely that simple men like the apostles, filled with the gift of the Holy Ghost, achieved the heights of wisdom and eloquence in a mere instant. In other words, when they were preaching to the crowd in Jerusalem after the gift of the Holy Ghost, that you had this is a religion that was not elaborated by Plato and Aristotle and other great minds of the ancient world. These are dumb fishermen, I say, and humble and not well educated, and yet they were able to preach a very lofty gospel and convert people that way. Above all, this newness must be reconciled, and St. Thomas says that's greater than a physical miracle. That's where he says, and I'm paraphrasing, okay, deny all the miracles of sacred scripture, just put them aside. then you have the spread of the gospel by these men in an empire that, the worst possible place as far as where it would be welcomed. Like Rome, like going to New York City and preaching it. It's just full of corruption and paganism and everything. And that this managed to convert an empire. That is a greater miracle than anything else you would, raising people from the dead or anything like that. That is a greater miracle. So to anyone who denies the miracles, just say, okay, let's look at this. How could that happen? So above all, this newness must be reconciled with the utterly great antiquity of the religion in question, where there can only be one divine religion for all men. If there's only one God, and if he revealed a religion, then there can be only one religion. True religion. Well, however, this is historically verified in Christ, who said, I have come not to do away with the law and the prophets, but rather to fulfill them. See, so the New Testament is something like a butterfly coming out of a caterpillar. In other words, that the caterpillar is meant to seed to the butterfly. I don't know if you know that butterflies come out of caterpillar. Okay. It was meant to introduce the New Testament, and so that it's a fulfillment of it. This excellent manner of teaching indicates the existence of a special intervention by God, who makes use of human language like a kind of instrument, although he himself is the one who perfects the activity interiorly. That's St. Thomas. A new sign is added if the preachers of the faith immediately begin to speak in various tongues, which heretofore were wholly unknown to them. It's in the Acts of the Apostles. So they were speaking in one tongue, obviously, probably their own, but they were being heard in the tongues of all of these people. That was a big feast day. There were a lot of Jews from all over the empire and speaking different languages. And St. Francis Xavier had that too. And St. Dominic had the gift of German, which would be a wonderful gift to get. You can pray for that. He had to preach in Germany. He got a gift of German. It's not an easy language. And I'm sure, you see, at the time you didn't have all of the helps that you have now, like books and the internet, and it's not like you could. And the German language was not organized at that time either. See, they sat down in the Renaissance and organized it according to essentially Greek rules. So they have the declensions and all that. So they have the 4 cases, and as Greek does. So they organized it. But even to this day, I mean, there's a lot of dialect in Germany. And I told you that one priest, the Bavarians so hate the Prussians, what they call the Prussians, that's northern Germany. They said they would prefer to speak English to each other than to speak the High German, the Prussian German. Well, the German that you see is High German. It's known as Hochdeutsch, and that's the Prussian German. And but it's not the Bavarian German. But they all speak it now. It's all standardized. But that's what they said, and they all speak English anyway. So but anyway, I don't think we need to go through these objections. I think if ever you had reason to, you know where it is. It's I don't think it's necessary. So number 2 on page 27, the utterly great and obvious holiness of a religion's founder, apostles, and martyrs. If this holiness is utterly great and obvious, it provides yet another sign, for such holiness cannot exist without some special intervention by God. Indeed, holiness is a virtue involving perfect purity from earthly things, as well as utterly firm union with God, indeed ordering all of the acts of the virtues to God. Now, the order of agents must correspond to the order of ends. That's a general metaphysical principle. Therefore, holiness cannot exist without God's aid. See, so, because the end is supernatural, so also the agent must be in some way supernatural. An extraordinary holiness comes from God intervening in the world in an extraordinary manner. However, this holiness appears most clearly in the heroic exercise of all the virtues. Common virtue perfects man in a human manner, whereas heroic virtue does so in a way that is superhuman. Indeed, when the brave man fears something when it should be feared, it is a virtue. However, if he does not fear it, it will be a vice. Now, if he fears nothing, trusting in God's aid, this virtue will be above the human mode of virtue, and such virtues are called divine. So that's St. Thomas. See, so, and this is seen in the martyrs and in other, just the missionaries and all. I mean, taking on things that ordinarily would cause a lot of fear. According to Benedict XIV, he was the one that organized all of the law concerning the canonizations of saints. 4 things are required so that heroic virtue can be said to have been proven. 1, that the matter was difficult above the common powers of men. 2, that the acts were performed promptly and readily. Indeed, 3, done with delight. And 4, and not only once or rarely, but rather frequently on a given occasion. So that's the qualities of heroic virtue. And that doesn't necessarily mean martyrdom. It could be a confessor or something like that. St. Thomas says there are certain virtues had by those who have already achieved likeness to God. These are called perfect virtues. Thus prudence sees only the things of God. Temperance knows no earthly desires. Courage knows no passions. And by imitating the divine mind, justice is united to it by an everlasting bond. We say that these virtues are had by the blessed, or in this life by those who are utterly perfect. Notice the footnote. The virtues of those in purgatory can be heroic, though heroism is found most clearly in the virtues of souls that have been purified. For example, St. Louis Bertrand remained at peace in the midst of the greatest dangers, and when he knew he had taken poison which had secretly been given to him, he remained tranquil and trusted in God alone. In the midst of the most bitter sufferings, he did not lament, but rather said, "Lord, burn here and cut things off there, so that you may refrain from doing it so eternally." Another holy priest, after being falsely accused of an atrocious crime, was suspended by his bishop and immediately gave thanks before the cross as being unworthy of such grace. See, so false accusation is a source of high virtue. St. Ignatius was falsely accused, and other saints were falsely accused. So, the holy deacon, Levita, Vincent, having been taken from his horse and carried off to the gibbet, I think that's how you pronounce that word, eagerly offered his executioners arguments so that they might hasten his demise, which they were delaying to bring about. And undaunted, he climbed up onto the grill of shining iron on his own, and unmoved there, standing erect in the light, looking to heaven, he prayed to God. So that's that's perfect virtue. It's perfection. Now, St. Thomas says, now of all the virtuous acts, martyrdom most greatly demonstrates the perfection of charity, for a man's love for a thing is manifested all the greater to the degree that what he despises for its sake is dearer to him, and that he chooses to suffer for its sake something more offensive to him. So what you cling to most naturally is your own life. And So therefore, if you're willing to give up your life in order to have something supernatural, that's a sign of heroic virtue. So that's why martyrdom is the clearest example of it. However, it is quite clear that of all the goods that man has in this present life, he loves life more itself most of all, and on the other hand, hates death equally as much, especially when it is accompanied by the pains of bodily torment. And as Augustine observes, even brute animals draw back from the greatest pleasures so as to avoid such pains. And for this reason, martyrdom clearly is the most perfect of human acts in respect to its Janus being the sign of the greatest charity. According to John, greater love than this no man hath, that a man lay down his life for his friends. All right. Hence, a martyr is said to be a kind of witness. Martyr means witness in Greek. To the Christian faith, displaying before our sight the idea that visible things should be scorned for the sake of invisible things. As said in Hebrews, indeed, nobody can scorn present things except out of hope for future goods. Indeed, such scorn is the principal means for overcoming the world, and therefore, because faith holds out invisible things to us, on account of which the world is to be held in scorn, therefore our faith conquers the world. That doesn't sound like the Douay, but... However, in order for true heroic virtue to be discerned as being something coming from God, in distinction from the false appearance of such virtue, beyond the four aforementioned conditions, we must consider the connection of the virtues in prudence and in charity. Indeed, we see that some people are prompt to perform courageous deeds on account of their natural makeup. So you might see soldiers or something do virtuous deeds where they risk their lives and so forth, because they're bold and courageous in a natural way. It's not to knock them. But that's not supernatural. It's not the same as giving your life for a supernatural reason. Or on account of some habits they have formed from custom, without, however, being ready to perform deeds of meekness, for nature is determined to one thing. See, so they might be prideful, they might be impure, so you have to have a connection of all the virtues in order to achieve perfection. So just for example, going into a burning building to save somebody, that is a great act of virtue, but if it is not connected to the other virtues, it's not perfection. However, if someone has all the virtues at once in a truly excellent manner, even those that are most distant from each other, like the greatest courage along with the heights of mercy, perfect love of truth and justice, simultaneously alongside the greatest mercy towards those who go astray, this is possible only through extraordinary assistance coming from God, who alone in his simplicity eminently contains utterly diverse perfections and can unite them together intimately within the human soul. So all of the virtues are at least, what's the word I'm looking for? Virtually in God. Obviously, God doesn't have the virtue of temperance, see, but it's virtually, all of the virtues are virtually in God, or they are eminenter and formally in God, such as justice. See, so God is truly all just, but he's not all temperate, but virtually he is. So in other words, he causes it. So the interconnection is the expression of a marvelous kind of harmony. Charity is patient, is kind. This is 1 Corinthians. Charity envieth not, dealeth not perversely, is not puffed up. It is not ambitious, seeketh not her own, is not provoked to anger, thinketh no evil. It rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth. It beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. It's a famous epistle. I think that's the hymn to charity. It occurs on, I think it's Quinquagesima Sunday. It's called the Hymn to Charity. St. Paul's Hymn to Charity. Very easy to preach about. I think it's Quinquagesima Sunday. It's one of the Isima Sundays. It's not septuagesima. It's either sexagesima or quinquagesima. Now this is important for, somewhat relating to Fenianism and whatnot. If true moral virtues can be found among non-believers, this does not seem to cause any issue. However, they can attain to a heroic degree of virtue, considering the nature of the thing. However, in order to be established as being truly heroic, the full collection of all the moral virtues is required. Now, no matter how many non-believers have been said to have heroic virtue on account of the excellence of a given moral virtue, they were lacking a number of other virtues and served the interests of certain vices, and therefore none of them was able to have been established as being strictly heroic, as is proven by Cardinals de Lauria and de Aguirre at length and by Teofilo Reno. So, all right. Go to the next page, page 31. By contrast, in founders and preachers of false religions and sects, uncharitable fanaticism is substituted for the firmness of faith, or liberalism without true faith for charity. So liberalism is substituted for charity, and there's no true charity without faith. In false prophets, we find ostentation without humility, obsequiousness without dignity, being angry in difficult situations, or rash without meekness, and pusillanimous without courage. Pusillanimous means receding from difficult things that you ought to do. It is the opposite of magnanimous, which means that you take on big projects or difficult projects without complaining. So we go to the next one, the wondrous propagation of religion. So this is another motive of credibility. Not the violence of arms, nor by the promise of pleasures. What is most miraculous of all, in the midst of tyranny, the tyranny of persecutors, an innumerable host, not only of the simple but also of the wisest men, flock to the Christian faith. In this faith, things exceeding every human intellect are preached, the pleasures of the flesh are restrained, and it is taught that all things are in the world to be held in contempt. We're preaching this to the Romans. It's just the opposite of everything that they live for. For the minds of mortals to assent to such things is the greatest of miracles, one that likewise is a manifest work of divine inspiration, so that men would come to seek only that which is invisible, doing so in contempt of that which is visible. See, so everything that we believe in is invisible. All the truths of the faith concern objects which are invisible. I don't know if you've figured that out. Even, the Holy Eucharist, visibly, that just looks like a piece of bread and a cup of wine, visibly. See, so the priesthood is invisible. See, so the effects of baptism are invisible. So the whole religion is invisible. To draw people to a contempt of the visible and to believe in things that are invisible is very, very difficult. However, this marvelous conversion of the world to the Christian faith is the most certain evidence of the signs from the past, that is, of miracles. such that it is no longer necessary that they be further repeated, since they are evidently apparent in their effect. Indeed, it would be more marvelous than all signs if the world were led by simple and humble men, without miraculous signs, to believe such difficult things, to perform such difficult actions, and to have so lofty a hope. This is St. Thomas saying this. So that would exceed raising people from the dead. So if somebody says, well, I don't believe that, you've got this historical fact that is undeniable. But those who founded those erring sects followed the opposite path, as it is clear from the case of Muhammad, who enticed people through promises of carnal pleasures. Heaven is girls, 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 to which the concupiscence of the flesh rouses men. Likewise, he preached precepts that were conformed to these promises, giving free rein to carnal pleasures, and carnal men were quite ready to obey him in these matters. See, so they're not known for chastity. Let's put it that way. He said that he was sent through strength of arms, signs which, however, are not lacking even in thieves and tyrants. So the conversion of Africa, northern Africa, and other places was done by the sword. Moreover, no wise men trained in things divine and human believed him from the start, but rather he was believed by brutal men wandering in the desert, wholly ignorant of divine teaching, and through their number, Muhammad forced others to follow his law by violence of arms. So that the value of this argument may be clear. So that would be an objection. Well, look at Islam, that was spread all over the place, but that's the answer to that. So that the value of this argument may be clear, we must manifest the absolute disproportion between this marvelous conversion of the world and natural causes, insisting on the loftiness of the end to be obtained and hindrances to its propagation, and the natural weakness of the apostles. So how do you have such an effect given all of those things? In other words, a complete contempt for visible things, all the hindrances to the propagation, persecution, and terrible hindrances, and the natural weakness of the apostles, that is, that they were ignorant men, very ordinary human beings. St. Peter said, I am a sinful man, depart from me, O Lord. So, but our Lord had sort of, in a certain way, an attraction to sinful people. He took St. Matthew, St. Mary Magdalene. He was very kind to the woman at the well, kind to the woman that caught in adultery. He didn't come to save the just. He came to save the sinners. Zacchaeus, I'll be in your house. I'm going to come to your house. He had in a certain sense, an attraction to the sinner, to save them, obviously. But it's amazing that he took St. Peter after St. Peter said, I'm a sinful man. That didn't stop our Lord. So those three things, as St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians, the weakness of God is stronger than men, but the foolish things of the world hath God chosen, that he may confound the wise. And the weak things of the world hath God chosen, that he may confound the strong. And the base things of the world, and the things that are contemptible hath God chosen, and things that are not, that he might bring to naught things that are, that no flesh should glory in his sight. See, so that has always been the path of God, to confound human pride, and to lift lowly people, weak people, to great heights of power and ability. Human beings constantly need to be confounded in their pride. Pride is the constant problem, and God never wants to let human beings think that they are eminent or in some way victorious by their own power. So many examples of that in the Old Testament. Likewise in 2 Corinthians, but we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the excellency may be of the power of God and not of us. So you mean earthen vessels, meaning himself and other apostles. We must note this quite carefully. The weakness remains in God's instrument, so that the supernaturality of the divine intervention may be made manifest more clearly. Now, St. Paul was, it says it in the Acts, that he was consenting to the stoning of Stephen. There were two sins there. First of all, murder. Secondly, they were not observing the Roman law. That is, the law said they couldn't put people to death without the approval of the state. Above all, one must argue from the fact that the vitality of the church is not diminished, but rather is increased through persecutions. As the Lord himself said, "Blessed are they that suffer persecution for justice' sake. Blessed are ye when they shall revile you and persecute you for my sake. Be glad and rejoice, for your reward is very great in heaven." So that has been the constant effect of persecutions in the Catholic Church, is that the Church bounces back from them and actually is stronger as a result of them. Above all, yes, that's right. For a historical exposition of this argument, see Book 2, Chapter 9 below. Okay. The fourth internal motive is the fruitfulness of religion in everything that is good. This fruitfulness must be considered in relation to the individual, family life, and society. In relation to the individual, inasmuch as his intellect is freed from errors concerning God, the world, and the soul, while the will is freed from the worst corruption of paganism. See, so if you follow the rule book, as I always say, of the Catholic faith, you would become a saint. In other words, it is drawing you to a very high level of virtue. And, yes, Catholics sin, obviously, but it's not in the rule book that they sin. So that's what I'm using. Just follow the rules and you become holy. And all of the teaching concerning God conforms to what is delivered by reason. See, there's nothing that is, if you were to just do natural theology, what is known as natural theology, which you do in De Deo Uno, it all conforms to reason. The oneness of God and all his attributes that you can reason to are all taught by the faith. Must be the heat. Steam heat does that. They don't do steam heat anymore, but when this building was built, that was it. Steam heat was like the latest thing. And so you get the pipes that I know because I grew up in a house that was built in 1926. Steam heat. So you always knew that the heat was on when you heard all this stuff. It was very consoling. But one thing about steam heat is that it comes up right away. So in relation to family life, inasmuch as the dignity of wives is here restored, you see, in not so much in Rome, but in many cultures of the ancient world, women were held in very low esteem, as in the Muslim world they are now. Like just almost like cattle. Romans is a little bit better, but see what Christianity did for the Roman Empire is that in a certain way it equalized everybody in a certain way, not with regard to their talents or their, it's not like everybody's the same, but with regard to how God sees them. In other words, the emperor must kneel at the communion rail right next to the slave, and everybody is dependent on the same sacraments and this, the same preaching, etc. As so it raised the idea of the slave, in other words, that he too is loved by God and that he has a place in the church, etc. And also women, because of the Virgin Mary. I mean, the place of the Virgin Mary, and so they were uplifted. There was a certain the word equality I hate because but there's an equality before God as creatures. That's true. So it transcends human dignities, human intelligence, and powers and everything, positions. It transcends all of that. See, so and that was very healthy. I'm sure I told you the Romans called slaves animals that talk. They had no use for slaves. I mean, they just disposed of them the way you would dispose of garbage. And they had the power of life and death over them in the Roman world. So to tell somebody, oh, by the way, your slave is as much loved by God and cherished by God as you are, oh really? It came as a shock. I mean, it was not something that fit hand in glove into, say, Roman culture, not at all. It was very contrary to everything that was held in high esteem in the Roman culture. So in relation to family life, inasmuch as the dignity of wives, he said that, is here restored, the protection and education of children fostered, and the harshness of slavery was tempered and gradually extinguished. See, the Catholic Church does not historically engage in political activism. It wants to accomplish any sort of political goals that it has by means of virtues, by instilling virtues, and it goes very gradually. So it didn't come in and say to Rome, you got to get rid of all your slaves. But with time and with what I just explained, the value of each soul in the sight of God would lead people to say, well, maybe I shouldn't have these slaves, or maybe I should pay them, or it would come from interior virtue rather than from an external participation in some political activism. So that's why Gregory XVI condemned the Poles who are rising up against the persecuting Nicholas I Tsar, because he said that's just not the place of Catholics to do that. The Poles are rising up against Tsar Nicholas I, and Catholics don't do that. And even though Nicholas I was persecuting the church, so just as the church never told Catholics to rise up against the persecuting emperors, even the worst of them, like Decius and all those, Diocletian and all. No, just you bear up, because the church does not concern visible things, it concerns invisible things. See? And so the role of the church is not to get involved in visible things. So that's all this business of bishops, trying to stop ICE and all of that. It's just not the place of the church to do that. And in fact, the government is just imposing its own laws, and the church should always uphold laws. And the laws of immigration are that's not against any kind of natural law or anything like that. Every country in the world has laws of immigration. So I mean, the fact it's the person I think that should go to jail is Biden and all those people, because they let those people in. I mean, that was a violation of their oath to uphold the Constitution and the laws of the country. So, but anyway, that's neither here nor there. But but the church should never be involved in any kind of political activism. But rather, if it sees disorder, it should work through virtue. So, in relation to society, inasmuch as legitimate authority, finding its foundation in God, is promoted, as well as due liberty, charity, and the natural laws common to all nations. So, due liberty. See, there are certain, the French Revolution made liberty into, literally into a goddess. That meant it's the Lockean notion of liberty. You can do whatever you want as long as you don't tread upon the liberty of others. That's John Locke. And it's typically Protestant. You see that I'm my own Lord, you might say, of my own conscience, and whatever I think is a good idea, and I can do whatever I want as long as I don't bother somebody else. See, that is not liberty in the Catholic sense. Liberty in the Catholic sense is a quality of the will. The will is fixed on the good, so liberty is always fixed on the good. So you elect the good rather than being determined to the good as animals are. See, so you see something, hamburger on Friday, you can say, well, today's Friday, I can't eat the hamburger. A cat cannot do that. If the cat's hungry, he's going to eat the hamburger. So you see and as you elect a good that is beyond the hamburger. See, even if you're very hungry. So liberty is merely a quality of the will, and the will is fixed on the good. The law indicates the good in principle. It actually wouldn't be a law if it did not indicate the good. So law and liberty have no conflict one with another. See, so where you have legitimate liberty is where you have a different means of achieving the end indicated by the law, or indicated by the will for the good. So if you decide I'm going to drive to New York City, well, there's a whole bunch of ways to drive to New York City. So you can elect different means. That's legitimate liberty, freedom of choice. It's legitimate freedom of choice. So all of the ways are bad. It doesn't matter which one you take. But you might think one might be better than another, depending on the day or the time of the day. But that's where liberty comes in. It is the election of the means with the preservation of the end. See, so the end is always New York City. What road you're going to take there? Well, that's due liberty of choice. See, but you don't have liberty of choice with regard to the end that is indicated by law, God's law, and legitimate human law. So there is and against that would be an oppressive government that constrains you too much with regard to those things, to your choice, legitimate choices. For example, in Russia, the Russian seminarians told me that you have, I think even at that time, this was in the early 2000s, that you had to ask the government to move. If you wanted to move, say, from St. Petersburg to Moscow, you would have to ask the government and get permission from the government to move. Because, you see, everything is controlled by the government, so if they need you as a worker in St. Petersburg, well, then you can't move. So that would be so alien. Imagine having to ask the local government if you can move to some place. Could you imagine? There'd be a riot. So socialism is excessively restrictive, and it also does not regard the family as having any authority. It doesn't regard anything as having authority under it. So the church or corporations, families, it just reaches down into everything and controls everything, and that's excessive. So anyway, that's just a footnote on liberty. Legitimate liberties, charity, And the natural laws, common to all nations, the jus gentium. Thus, tyranny and license are shunned. See, tyranny is excess government. License is just do whatever you please. As well as the interpersonal confusion arising from communism and the personal separation involved in individualism. So, see, individualism is the result of Protestantism. That's John Locke. In other words, I can do whatever I please. I am not. Also, society is something that is manufactured by human beings. It's not something that pertains to divine law. The church would say government is something that is natural law, that human beings have government and that they are ruled by governments. That's something that is not optional for human beings. But see, individualism means that, well, I can do what I want, and I enter into a social contract whereby I give to the government what is properly mine, meaning my own dominion over myself. So I'll give the government some of that in order that we don't shoot each other. And that's John Locke. The Rousseau is he's the famous social contract man. He copied it all from John Locke. He was we'll get into Rousseau, but it's all John Locke, and John Locke is the mastermind of all the principles of American government. They were all loaded with John Locke. Samuel Adams, Jefferson, particularly, all those prime movers were all loaded with those ideas. So that's a whole other thing. And the opposite of individualism is communism, and individualism gave rise to communism. See, excessive personal liberty in economics. That's the 19th century, where workers were horribly oppressed, living in squalor and in horrible conditions, working conditions. That's true in the 19th century. And the reaction to that was, well, we have to have the government intervene, which is true. You have to have the government intervene in that. But it went the other way. In other words, that the government should actually be the one thing that controls the entire economy, including corporations and production, etc. That's communism. So, and the mean, in other words, the golden mean is that there should be legitimate liberty and some government oversight and control, so that people don't take advantage of others, etc. Or to avoid communism as well. I mean, otherwise you stifle the economy, and that all the communist economies have flopped right on their faces because it's so stifling. It means that you cannot form your own business if you want. You're just just an employee of the government, and they tell you where to work. So, I mean, this communism in its proper state. Many times there are countries like China where they introduce non-communist principles in order to have an economy. But a place that is very, very like Cuba or Venezuela, where there is true communism, that's why you see these young people that are thinking about communism. I mean, it's amazing that something can fail so much and still have an attraction. I mean, it's just one series of failures. France, which is so very socialistic, has a higher public debt than we do. It has the biggest public debt, national debt of any country in the world. And their economy is probably maybe 1/10 of the US economy. And they have a national debt of more than we have. We have $37 trillion. They have more. It reminds me of 1789 because their government is broke. And that's what brought on the French Revolution, is that the government went broke, and it was an occasional cause. In other words, well, what are we going to do? We have to tax the nobility. Well, they didn't want to be taxed. So, and then there were all sorts of maneuverings and whatnot, and poor Louis was not this, let's say, the brightest light in you know, he meant well, but every decision he made was wrong, and that's what occasioned the French Revolution, was the big financial crisis. It gave rise to all of the ferment about Rousseau and Voltaire and all of these social ideas and all the anti-Catholic ideas, but that was an occasional cause. It's like lighting the match. So I'm wondering, that reminds me of 1789, and he's doing the same thing. He's moving around various ministers. You know, what should we do? You know, that's exactly what Louis XVI did. So he might end up getting his head chopped off. I don't think it'll go that far, but he might be ousted. That's because they're giving away so much money with they're a socialist state. The socialist state gives away money like crazy, even that it doesn't have. So they don't have any more money. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, amen. Subtuum praesidium confugimus sancta Dei genitrix nostros deprecationis et despicias et necessitatibus, sed a periculis cunctis libera nos semper, viva gloriosa benedicta. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.